Periodically Productions presents Fairy Tales for Unwanted Children. The Hunter, the Hare by Scott Thrower. The hare crashed through the underbrush on unfamiliar paws. It was long-legged and the color of the mud it splashed through, crossing paths and scrabbling at the forest floor with each turn, whipped at by branches that threatened its wide, frantic eyes. Its ears stretched along its back, listening for the pursuit, which was drowned out by its own clumsiness. With a leap, it crossed a stream as wide as a man was tall, but it landed poorly in a hand, no, still a paw, flared with pain. It shifted its ears, hearing the pack of men crashing through the trees, and the hare was off again, stumbling more as the wounded leg sometimes collapsed under its weight. The men noisily crossed the stream, baying at their quarry, which was weaving on and off the path, slipping on wet leaves and hurtling through the underbrush. It was lost and searching, but everything was new again, and the wash of it threatened to drown the creature as it leapt. It reached the tree line and saw before it the lands of men, with plowed fields and stone fences, cottages trailing smoke and leaning barns of battered wood. But the hare slid to a heaving stop. Behind it, the pack grew ever more vicious, as if they could sense the hare's hesitation and knew their victory was at hand. The hare could hear branches snap like bones as the men tore their way towards it. With a final glance at the homes and tended fields, the hare was off, following the forest's edge. At least here the land was even, and the hare pushed as hard as it could, still trying to remember to use all four legs. Tumbling when on instinct, it would rise up on two. It had to keep reminding itself to make use of the world of unders, as it continued to think in terms of over. And the hare prayed the pack was making the same mistakes in reverse. Finally, on open land, the pack fell behind, and after awkwardly leaping a stone fence, the hare spared a moment to look back. The pack ran through a wheat field 2 fences behind, running in a disorganized frenzy. Some still ran with a hunch, leaping from feet to hands, and others paused to sniff at the air or ground, puzzled by the muted scent of their new world. The hare raced on. Slower now as its spirits flagged and its wounded leg burned hotter, and it turned back into the forest where it sought a place to hide. It looked first to climb, before remembering, and then it looked for low places. Finally, it eased its way back into a prickly shrub and settled in, trying to force its heart to quiet, and listening for the pack, with tall, flicking ears. The world was alive with sound, and it was surprised to realize that it had probably always been so. The world was also wider than the hare remembered, and thick with scents both familiar and strange. It could twitch its nose and be overwhelmed by the scope of it, though little could be named, except for the general decay of trees, the sweat of men, and the coppery tang of blood. As the hare waited, frozen, it thought of the white stag, the creature of legend that stood half again as tall as a man. It thought of the bone-wide antlers that rose up like winter trees, and the dark eyes that had stared at him as he raised his bow. He thought of the baying of his dogs as they encircled the beast, and the delicate backward step it took as it prepared to flee. The pack was passing close now, slow as they crept through the forest. Some stumbled as they tried to walk like men, while others dragged their bellies on the ground as they sniffed and growled. The hare briefly glimpsed a filthy face with an opened cheek that must have been torn in the pursuit, and it was thankful for its muddy brown fur in the darkness of the bush. They circled the clearing, looking both high and low, tearing at branches and roots. One reached out for the shrub, but the same prickles that dug into the hare's side tore at the man's hand, and he quickly moved away and began to lap at his fingers. And then the pack was gone, moving deeper into the forest. The hare sighed and slumped exhaustedly down into the jagged branches of the bush. It was not sure how long it slept, but when it awoke, it was dark. The smells were different, and the sounds had changed. The hare carefully eased its way out onto the path, but there was no scent of man or dog, just earth and air, and the dark rot of the forest floor. It dragged its now useless leg, slowly moving back towards the land of men and considering what to do. It had to find the white stag and convince it to release the curse. But most men lived entire lifetimes without encountering such a beast, and the hare felt certain it would not happen twice. That left the wise man who lived alone by the river making pots he sold to strangers whose boats passed along the banks. Or perhaps the witch with the little house in the deep wood, who made salves and poultices for women whose desperation for help often outweighed their fear of trees and fairies. The hare slowly limped towards the river, deciding it had had more than enough of the forest. And it spent most of the next day in tall grasses and fields, freezing at every small sound and hiding with every change in the wind. But eventually it reached the pottist's house near the wide river. The wise man was old, and as the hare arrived he was feeding wood into a kiln set into a hill. He peered at the hare for a moment when it dropped down near the fire, and neither spoke until the kiln was fed and the sun began to drop. "Wise man," said the hare as the man sat down beside it, "I have been cursed by the white stag." But the man shook his head at his guest, as if a talking rabbit were as common as corn. "I think you'll find you have not," the wise man replied as he stoked the flames and stirred the pot that sat amongst them. The hare shifted, lanced with a pain from its wounded leg. "I was a man and now I am not. How could that be anything but a curse?" The pot let out the heavenly smell of boiling broth as the spices bubbled away, but the hare's pain was stronger than hunger. When the man was done, he shuffled away from the heat of the fire and turned to the hare, shaking his head sadly. "Because you're not that important," he said quietly, "and the white stag has never been touched by anger, or hate, or malice." The hare was silent for a moment, speechless. It felt the wind through its whiskers, heard the crickets as they cheered on the calming night, and listened to the distant baying of dogs. "I am a hunter. I have killed dragons and giants and boar. Just yesterday I raised my bow and took aim at the fabled white stag of legend and wonder. How can you say I'm not important?" "Let me tell you a story," the wise man said, settling back in the cool grass. "Once upon a time, a potter met a fairy, and the potter was so hungry that he made an unwise decision to make a deal. A deal with the fairy is a dangerous thing, but the potter felt the stakes were so low that nothing could go wrong. 'I'll give you fine pots,' the potter said, 'if only you fill my belly.' The potter had not eaten for many days, and when food is valuable, pots are not. So he felt this deal was good. 'I do not see the point of this,' the hare said, 'and I am in need of help.' But the wise man continued as if he had not heard. So the fairy offered the potter food. Fairy delights of sugar and gold, flowers and pastry. But the man was wise and wary about the tricks of fairy deals, so he knew better than to eat anything a fairy had touched. 'It is my leg, wise man, and this transformation,' the hare interrupted. But again he was ignored. And so the wise man made a deal, saying that if the fairy could supply a meal that had never met a fairy's hand, the fairy folk could have all the pots they needed. "What has any of this to do with me?" For a moment the wise man looked sadly at the hare beside the fire and hoped the thing would run. Just bound away on its wounded leg and live out its days in the forest. But instead he reached out to take it by the ears, and reached for the knife on his belt. "Why do you tell me this story?" the hare screamed, struggling to be free. "Show that not all stories are about you," the wise man said, turning his head away as he raised the knife. "And to remind myself that fairies don't deal fair." Did you find a moral for this week's story? Let us know on Twitter at periodicallypod, or join the Fairy Tales for Unwanted discussion group on Facebook. For more fairy tales for unwanted children, join us at unwantedchildren.ca.